right, so in our last set of notes, we talked a great deal about the Second Industrial Revolution. And at about the same time as the Industrial Revolution, we also see a trend. We see many Americans and immigrants starting to settle the region west of the Mississippi in a major migration during, again, the second half of the 1800s, early 1900s. And this is all with the help of the federal government. So one South Dakota settler, Mary Clark, says this about her settling in the West, her and her family. The winds are too fierce. It actually blows the feathers off of the chickens' backs. I can't put up many pictures and things, for every time the door opens, they all blow off the wall. We notice how terribly loud everyone talks out here, and now we find ourselves just shouting away at the top of our voices. Unless you yell, you can't be heard at all. And so in this section of notes, we're going to be talking a lot about basically what made people want to start moving west. All right, so some of the push and pull factors. The push factors that kind of push people to move toward the western region. And again, this is going to be the region west of the Mississippi River. Some of these push factors were conditions that urged settlers westward because they wanted to escape something. And so because they wanted to escape something, they are literally pushed away and towards the west. This allowed people a second chance at life. So many people who were living in the city during this time, again, this is right smack down in the middle of the Second Industrial Revolution. People were having a really, really tough time living in the city. They weren't being paid much for their work. They were working really long hours. The cities were really crowded because of urbanization, which we'll talk a great deal more about. We'll also talk about tenement housing and how crowded it was. There was no garbage collection, no codes for living in homes. Very little homes had fire escapes, and just to name a few. And again, some of these conditions that these people were living in the city really pushed them west. It appealed to them. Also, there was inexpensive land, and we'll get into that in more detail a little later on. Religious freedom. So some people were being ridiculed because of their religious choice. They wanted to escape this. Not only, or mostly in foreign areas. Overcrowded cities, and then discrimination. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later section, but some of our African Americans were being discriminated against, and so this kind of pushes them towards the west as well. And then pull. So pull factors are going to be temptations and adventures that lured or pulled settlers westward. And so these are things that are going to be actually in the west. So like riches, gold, silver, oil, the potential to make money. Railways allow for faster transportation for us to get from east to west. The Pacific Railroad Act, which we'll talk more about in detail here in a little bit. The Morrill Land Grant Act, Homestead Act, and then also the opportunity to have private property. So again, your push factors are going to be things that you're trying to escape. You're being pushed away from these things that you do not want to be a part of any longer. And then your pull factors are going to be things that are already out west, and then they literally pull you towards them because they look appealing. So why did the government give away land? And that's what you're going to see with the Homestead Act. And again, they didn't necessarily give it away. It was just very, very cheap. And the reason that they do this is because they really wanted to get immigrants and poor urban Americans into the country to expand the nation. And they figured if they did this, if they offered land for a very, very, very cheap price, then people would move. Okay, so the Pacific Railroad Act, 1862 and 1864. The government gives large land grants to the Urban Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads. This happens from 1850 to 1871. The railroads received more than 175 million acres of public land, which is 1/10 the size of the nation, larger than Texas. And railroads sold portions of their land at high prices to the wealthy farmers, ranchers, and this land was extremely desirable. Now, why was that? So if we look at this poster over here, it kind of explains why this land was so desirable. It says temperate climate, excellent health, pure and abundant water, good soil for wheat, corn, and fruit, the best stock in the world. And so these types of propaganda were released all over the area and really encouraged people to buy the land. All right, Morrill Land Grant Act. This is passed by Congress. It gave state governments millions of acres of western lands, which the states could then sell to raise money for the creation of colleges and universities. Kansas State University was the first to establish under the act in 1863. And this was, obviously the government's goal or Congress's goal here was to expand education. The Homestead Act, settlers paid a very small fee for 160 acres of land. Some of the conditions: you had to be 21 years of age, you had to be an American citizen or immigrant filing for citizenship. You had to build a home at least 12 by 14, live in it for 6 months to a year, and then farm the land for 5 years in a row. The act created more than 372,000 farms. By 1900, settlers had filled 600,000 claims for more than 80 million acres under the Homestead Act. And so obviously this really appeals to people. They have the opportunity to kind of start over, to escape the city and the horrible conditions working in factories, and move west and hopefully, get back what they originally started with before the Second Industrial Revolution, and first for that matter. And so, it really appeals to them. And so they move west, and some of them quickly learn that it's going to be a lot harder than they originally thought. Okay, so settlers from far and wide. White Easterners who were city livers looking for a second chance. This was one particular group we saw move west. Also European immigrants seeking land to farm. We also saw German settlers who established farms in the Great Plains. Irish, Italian, Chinese, all in search of jobs. Mexicans and Mexican Americans, they contribute to the growth of ranching. African Americans, exodusters, they were called exodusters, primarily because they were fleeing the South and they were fleeing discrimination. And the word exodus means a group who go on a journey to escape a hostile environment. And this was the perfect name for African Americans fleeing their current situation in the South, because that's exactly what they were doing. They were fleeing a hostile environment. They were fleeing the Jim Crow laws in the South. And we'll talk a lot more about what those Jim Crow laws were in a later section. So the above group spoke many different languages, believed in different religions, and practiced a variety of customs. Also, there was about 50,000 African Americans, or exodusters, that wanted to escape discrimination in the South. All right, clashing out west. During the Civil War, Native Americans west of the Mississippi inhabited their traditional homelands without any issue. After the Civil War, clashing began. Intrusions of land. Treaties were made between Native Americans and the United States government, which restricted where both parties could live in order to try and stop the fighting. These treaties created reservations for Native Americans. Reservations are just federal land set aside for them. Treaties produced misunderstandings and outright fraud. Federal agents selected chiefs to sign treaties and did not represent the entire tribe. Treaties weren't always honored by the U.S. government. Some federal agencies forced tribes to sign treaties with violence. Chiefs and tribes often did not know they were restricted to reservations and that they might be in danger if they left. The settlers justified their actions because they believed that they were making the land more productive, and Native Americans believed that they were just invading. Another big issue with these treaties was that you have to remember that the Native Americans and the U.S. government officials did not speak the same languages, and so it was very hard to communicate with one another. And a lot of times when a federal official would talk with a Native American or try to talk with a Native American, there would be that issue of miscommunication and misunderstanding. And so a lot of times Native Americans would sign documents, but they didn't know what they were signing. And we knew that. They didn't understand that they were signing away land because that's not exactly how we worded it. So we definitely tricked them at times. All right, the spread of Western mining. In 1848, gold at Sutter's Mill, California, created a surge of fortune hunters. From single men to whole families, they set their sights on minefields of the West. From 1850 to 1890, rumors of gold strikes were all over the West, from Colorado to Utah and California. And this was the desire to discover riches such as gold, silver, oil. And is this a pull factor or is it a push factor? What do you think? If you said a pull factor, you would be right. Because again, this was something that was already out west. There were already riches out west, and people hear about that. And they desperately want to start over and become wealthy. And so this pulls them out west, this opportunity to be wealthy. All right, cattle boom. Before the Civil War, pork was the meat of choice for most Americans. So why all of a sudden switch to beef? This is because around this time, cookbooks began calling pork difficult to digest and unwholesome. And so people started looking for alternatives. And from 1860 to 1880, cattle went from $3 to $6 a head, to 40 to 80 per cattle. So shipping live cattle by rail was expensive, but it was the only way. In 1870, however, the invention of refrigeration on the railroad cars allowed animals to be slaughtered before shipping. This development cut transportation costs in half. So what group of people primarily led to the growth of ranching in the West? This would be Mexican and Mexican Americans. Also understand that after the Civil War, there was a high demand for meat in cities where large populations of people lived. However, most cattle ranches were hundreds or thousands of miles from the cities, and this began the great era of the cattle drive. So in a little bit, we'll watch a video on the cattle drive, and that will clear up any misunderstandings that you may or may not have about how that process works. These are just some of the different positions that were typically held during a cattle drive. So we had a trail boss, a cook, a cowboy, a wrangler, and they all had different responsibilities and received different pays, had different schedules and requirements. So the trail boss typically led the crew of 12 men, and they were kind of in charge of making decisions, like for the best welfare of the cattle and the cowboys. They would also be responsible for handling money, paying the crew. They got about $125 per month. They would work from before sunrise until sunset. The cook, obviously, must be able to drive a mule, a mule-drawn wagon, provide 3 hot meals per day for the workers, got about 60 per month, and again, sunrise to sunset. Cowboys would be responsible to work together with other cowboys to drive herd, 30 to 40 a month, and then wranglers would be responsible for the horses on a cattle drive to Kansas, will feed